Welcome to The State of Us. Real people with honest opinions and the future of responsible media. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
President Trump announced economic sanctions in response to Iran's launch of ballistic missiles against two bases that typically have U.S. personnel present. How much power should a president have? Well, we're going to look at the Iran situation today, break down some of the details, hopefully help you understand how we got here if that's all got lost in this 24-hour news cycle. I know that until today, when I was preparing for the show, it had for me, because it feels like we're just from one thing to the next. So we're going to break that down, but we'll also discuss some of what should a president be able to do and what should a president not be able to do without authorization from Congress. So we'll break down what's changed in the last 20 years or so, and where do we go from here. Hopefully it's pretty obvious why you care about this. Anytime the U.S. uses military force, it has the potential to endanger those of us that live in the United States, and inevitably it has an impact on the world economy. So pretty much if you live anywhere on planet Earth, this pretty much probably concerns you in some way, shape, or form. Of course, we couldn't begin this critical conversation on the economy, Iran, and everything presidential without
your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Well, the key is here you're talking about presidential power, and you're talking about a conflagration starting in the Middle East, which I think makes it even bigger when you look at the Straits of Hormuz and oil supply and oil prices and how the economy is dependent upon oil. So those items, particularly with the region of the country that it's taking, or the region of the blue there, the region of the world that it's taking place makes it even more important.
So let's break down a little bit of how exactly did we get here? Because like I said, with the news cycle the way it is, it can be a little complicated. Now, it wouldn't be fair to say that this all started in May of 2019 because the U.S.-Iran history goes back substantially further than that.
1979.
Right. We've got an article.
I can talk about that. I'm old enough. The oldster in the room.
Okay.
You know, I remember American hostages being taken because it's the only time in my lifetime that I said I was ready to go serve and fight.
Yeah.
Because most of the time I thought we should not be involved. But then, when the Iranians took the American hostage, I was ready to go. I was a freshman in college and I came home and I looked at my mom and I said, all they got to do is say the word and I'm going because they're messing with us. So that was my most.
For our avid listeners, that should mean something if they've gotten
right.
Lance,
if you listen
right?
to the show, that I'm not usually one who advocates violence.
Yeah.
But
in
I
that
was
situation.
In 1979 when the American hostages were taken in the 52 American hostages were taken in the U.S. Embassy in Iran. That was like stepping into our land and saying, let's go. That, I guess that was my 9/11. But I had some questions about 9/11. I did when they took the hostages. So when you think about Iran, and I don't mean to come in here, but that's huge to me. That's the date where this started. It's been, and I think we need to go back to there and say, we've been dealing with this area, this place for 40 years.
Right. So if you want to go all the way back to 1979, kind of understand how we got to now and the government history of Iran, then you can go to the article we've got linked at thestateofus.org. It's from the BBC. But if we just go back to May of 2019, here's what you need to know. There were 4 oil tankers that were damaged near Iran, and the U.S. blamed Iran for the attack, but didn't produce any evidence to actually, definitively say that Iran did this. And Iran also publicly denied those accusations. The following month, a U.S. military surveillance drone was shot down by Iranian forces who said it was in their airspace. The U.S. military insisted that the drone was in international waters at the time and said the attack was unprovoked. So we've got they said, we said, they,
right.
This back and forth.
Typical.
Yeah. So nothing terribly unusual there. President Donald Trump tweets, quote, Iran made a very big mistake. He said was only 10 minutes away from an airstrike, but pulled back after being told that 150 Iranians would be killed. Some experts think the explosions were in response to the U.S. rules and restrictions designed to stop other nations from buying Iranian oil. but that's mostly speculation. Since then, the countries have continued the fallout, which ultimately led to the U.S. Killing one of their terrorist leaders. I mean, I think it's fair to say that, right, Lance? But nonetheless, somebody who was installed in military positions, so it made them very upset.
Right.
General Soleimani. So, and Iran then proceeded by bombing bases that typically have U.S. personnel at them, but were very careful to not actually kill any U.S. personnel, knowing, I'm sure full well, that would have changed what we got today, which was President Trump's response to all of that. So if you're not thoroughly confused, congratulations. But it's basically a case of we said, they said, we said, they said, and then some escalation through deepening of tensions by, basically us taking action to kill.
But we're going to take it in a different route and not necessarily talk about this.
Right.
But talk about how this points out how much power the president has.
Yes.
So
in the next segment of the show.
Right.
Yeah.
By the time you listen to this isn't so much about what went down, but why it was allowed and been able to be handled in this manner. That's the take that we're going to look at.
Right. And so we'll be getting into that in the second half of the show. And then in the third part, talk about kind of where do we go from here. But a little bit to wrap up on this. I think part of what's hard, Lance, and tell me if you disagree, but part of what's difficult in situations like this, why should the American public care, right? I'm 18 years old. I'm in high school. I'm going to college, and something's going on in the Middle East. Iran's doing something. They said that we did something. They may have bombed something, but we don't know because there's no evidence. I mean, who the hell cares, right? I mean, really, why? Why should I even attempt to understand what's happening in the Middle East?
I don't know if you can say, well, number one, I'm not sure you can totally understand it.
Why should I even try to keep up with it?
As someone who's been trying to keep up with it for the last 40 years since I was 18, because I think it is a very important. It kind of replaced the Soviet Union in the annals of how important the United States was, because the Cold War and everything. But yes, the Middle East is, because you can look back over the last 2,000 years and every major world power has tried to control this region and failed.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But the biggest reason is that's where the oil is. And yes, we've become more, not as dependent on foreign oil. We've become more of a country that can produce our own. But in the world economy, the oil that comes out of the Middle East goes right through or right next to the land in Iran, through a place called the Straits of Hormuz, which is very narrow and the ships there can be easily attacked by anyone.
And much of the world is dependent on that.
And much of the world is dependent on it. So yeah, we may not need it right now because we're producing enough for ourselves, but we're not producing enough for ourselves and to replace oil that would be destroyed coming out of that part of the world. And so this is where you could really disrupt the world economy, which in turn would affect us. I think that's the most important reason, but it's hard to say A, B, or C. But also, there has been a lot of fighting that has gone on in this region by American troops.
Right.
We
have people that die there frequently.
Right. And so we have a current president who has been talking about how all the other presidents were wrong to be there. And now some fear, and I'm not sure if it's rightfully so or not, we'll talk about that later. Some fear that we are getting involved in another fight, which would cause even more Americans, and especially if you are in that age group of 17 to 25, who would be asked to go or who might feel led to go because things could escalate to the point where Americans are being killed or endangered. So there's two reasons. I'm not sure there's an A or a B there.
Let me expand real quick on
economy.
The economy one, because I'm just hearing, and I mean, you work with kids all the time,
right?
And I've got a bunch that I coach, and we have interns here at True Chat, right? I mean, some immediately get why I should care about the economy, but then there's the other side of, I don't really care though, right? Well, if you're going to have a job in the U.S. anywhere, or if you like, if you may not like what you pay for your iPhone right now. You may wish it was less, but my guess is you don't wish it was twice as expensive as what it is now. And those are the types of real things that issues like this can affect.
If you use public transportation or you drive your own vehicle, it could get you could get twice as expensive almost overnight.
Sure.
Because the buses, the railways, everything, the subways.
And can you still afford
cars,
to get to your job that's an hour away?
Right.
If the price of transit doubles for you?
Right.
I mean, I don't know. That's person specific, but it definitely changes things.
It wasn't that long ago that I was paying $4 a gallon here in the Midwest, and it was almost $6 a gallon in California. So
right.
You're talking about, that's what we're talking about. We talk about the economy. You're talking about some of your technology costs, but also your transportation costs. And then, like you said, does it even benefit you at all to go to work?
Right.
If you're going to pay that much money to put fuel in your car.
Yeah. So now you're making
or to pay the subway.
You might be making life decisions about, I'm going to change jobs to work somewhere that's closer to where I live because I don't want to pay that type of money to commute that far. And so I think that's really the question. So we've kind of so far gone through what exactly the situation is with Iran. Granted, we're not going to spend most of the show on that. We told you that up front. Mainly because you can get that from the 24-hour news cycle. Hopefully we laid it out for you in a way that helps you understand this is how we got here in a basic understanding. If you want to go back past May of 2019, a reminder, the article from the BBC is linked at thestateofus.org. It's linked at thestateofus.org. We've got more to come. We're going to talk about the powers of the president and whether or not President Trump's actions are unprecedented. Keep it right here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
President Trump announced economic sanctions in response to Iran's launch of ballistic missiles. He also authorized the killing of one of the generals that ultimately, divided people in Iran, but many held up on a pedestal, General Soleimani. And that raises questions about how far do the powers of the president extend, and should they extend this far? Should they really enable a president to unilaterally order the killing of foreign assets like this? And maybe the answer, right, especially if you're closer to my age, if you're a millennial, maybe the answer is yes, because you've grown up in a world where that's been the case. But here's the important thing. It has not always been that way. We're turning to the New York Times now, and this article, again, linked at thestateofus.org. Before I get into it, though, Lance.
Right.
We're talking about this, and we're going a different path, right? Because that's one of those things that we do here on The State of Us. And that's because TrueChat, the company responsible for The State of Us, all the shows are pursuing a common goal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what is that common goal?
Well, our goal is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations.
And the website, of course, has the mission statement, but it also has, and this is important, not only links to all the episodes, but the books that Lance and I are reading that have been featured on the show, books that are coming up, and all the different ways to tune in. This is a syndicated radio program, and it's a podcast, so there's a lot of different ways to listen. And the easiest way to figure out where you can listen on an ongoing basis is thestateofus.org. Of course, you can also listen there. So let's talk a little bit about the powers of an American president. Those powers to wage war have grown stronger for nearly 2 decades, ever since the September 11th attacks led the United States into an era of perpetual conflict. The war-making powers that Congress granted to the president in the years since the September 11th attacks, combined with stunning advances in the technology of manhunting, have given the inhabitant of the Oval Office unprecedented power. Now, one thing here, Lance, to note, I think, at this point, that's important for people to understand, right, is that especially in the early days of our republic, shortly after the Constitution was put in place, there were vigorous debates, right, about how and when to go to war, because our nation was very weary of that. Not only weary of waging into conflict, but also weary of how much leadership a president should have. I think back to, and we actually, I guess I can tease this now because we have the book. We're going to be doing an episode in the coming weeks on the Adams family, President John Adams, our second president. But it's not actually about him. It's about his descendants, America's political dynasty in the Adamses. But, he comes to mind immediately as one that was immediately faced with, should we get involved in the British-French war? What should we do? And Washington was very much dealing with that as well. And I remember that, thinking one of the reasons that Adams didn't get a second term is because he made the decision, despite that the American people wanted to go to war, that the country couldn't handle it. And he wasn't terribly comfortable with expanding the powers of the president. He was concerned about, if we go to war with me as president, what decisions will I make that set precedents? So that it's interesting, right, to look at that and then to think about where we are now.
Well, sure, because let's face it, you mentioned the last 20 years, which is why younger people like you think that what is going on now is the common way we've handled things, because that's the way it's been in their lifetime. But you go back to when you were talking, and even more into the 20th century, most people felt like the power rested in the hands of Congress, and being a congressman was more powerful than being the president. It's only been through the events of the last 200 years that we've turned around and started making the presidency seem like it's the most powerful branch of the government. And I would argue that it's because the House and the Senate have ceded powers that the Constitution gives them to the president, because I don't know why. I don't know why they would do that, but they have, and they've made it easier for one person to make decisions, be it a Democrat or Republican. This isn't a bash the president episode necessarily. This is, we have given in the last 20 years, whoever holds the office of the president, powers that have never been seen before in this country.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that's,
and it's for me, that's a scary situation,
because it was
not because of who's in power, but
right,
because we're letting one person make that decision. And in our overall history, that has not been the dominant case.
No. And to me, I think it's important to remember, why was the decision made in the first place, right? And the decision was made, I don't believe, Lance, out of logic. It was made out of fear, right? And now, fear on a couple different levels.
You're talking about originally in the Constitution.
No.
To do it this way, or this.
I'm talking about the last 20 years.
Oh, yes.
September 11th.
Sure. It was.
Yeah. It was two things, right? Pandering to the American people.
Yep.
And an abdication of responsibility. And what I mean by that is, Congress used to bear more responsibility for military actions being taken. And now they can just shift the blame off on the president when it suits them. So if things are going well, we're supporting,
we're in there with them.
We're supporting the president, we're on his side. And then if it goes bad, we can say, well, we didn't authorize it and we're not okay, and then they can play that card of, well, we never gave him.
Well, I remember as the fighting waged on year after year after 9/11, one of the ways that the Democrats in the House tried to influence the Republican president was, well, you can fight if you want, but we're going to withhold the money.
Right.
And then the argument became, then the American people retaliated and said, you mean our young men and women who are over there fighting aren't going to get the best equipment? Because that was how, because
you won't have any money?
Because Congress had ceded so much power to the office of president that the only way Congress had to control the fighting was to control the purse strings, which was a power they hadn't given up.
Right.
I mean, I don't know if that makes sense to our listeners, but that's not the way the Constitution read, or reads. It says war-making powers rest in the hands of the legislative branch.
Mm-hmm.
And that power has dramatically gone to the way, because Congress has allowed it, as you pointed out, to say, you know what, we're going to let the president make the call on this one.
Right. Because you could blame George W. for expanding it. You could blame Obama for expanding executive. But that goes back to...
This is not a Republican or Democratic issue.
It's a checks and balance thing, right? I mean, this is the whole...
That's out of whack.
Yeah.
In my opinion, it's a checks and balance situation that has been allowed to get out of whack because so many Americans wanted revenge for what happened in 9/11.
You don't hear any of the presidential candidates talking about it either.
Well, if they were in Congress at the time, they voted to do all of it.
So it's hush-hush. Because we wouldn't want to admit, Lance, that we made a wrong decision and that we've changed our minds now.
Right.
It's like that whole thing, right? That the members, some of the Democratic candidates who are running for president now, who were supportive of the war effort, now really, it's like they don't acknowledge it, you know? They don't deny it, but it's kind of like, well, I don't talk about that, you know, because I don't want to have to stand by my position because they look at like that's the only option. And we've talked about that, I know, a lot of times, but that has to change.
And I don't want people to think that, well, I didn't think what happened in 9/11 was horrible and we needed to get at the people who did it. But that doesn't mean you send troops into countries to fight when you're fighting terrorists that exist anywhere and everywhere in the world.
And it doesn't mean Congress signs away its authority to oversee that process.
Get that. Right. But 20 years ago, when I was saying that as one of the 10% of the American public, I was being chastised all over the place.
Sure.
And now people have come to that conclusion like, oh, wow, that's not the way we should have fought terrorism. But like you said, well, I'd have to admit I made a mistake, so I just don't talk about it.
Here's something I'm hearing a lot from, and I'm not trying to pick on the Democratic field. People know that I am not a big President Trump fan. You know, people know I didn't vote for him. So make sure that if you're looking at the Democratic field, that you understand these criticisms that Lance and I have are because we would probably like for one of them to win. Okay, and therefore being critical of them is making them better. I'm gonna share something with our listeners to think about as we go to break, because the next thing that we're talking about, okay, is where do we go from here? What should the presidential power be? And I think part of that question lends itself to, well, what do the American people want, right? I mean, because that's ultimately what it always comes back to is what does democracy say? And here's the kicker. I've been hearing a lot of Democratic candidates for president, Lance, right? They're on this whole thing about we have to put an end to endless war. We have to put an end to endless war, right? Because they're referring to these Middle East conflicts as, you know, we can't just keep going this endless war route. And the interesting thing here is, any idea how much of our history we've been, quote unquote, at war, Lance?
I know, but I know that when I taught history, I don't know the number of years, but I would point out the number of wars that we had fought and how often it was that we were fighting somebody somewhere.
The misnomer, right, that the American public, I guess you could still say they're wary of it. You know, they're tired of being at war.
Well, are they weary or are they leery? You know, are they tired of it? Or are they kind of like, I'm not sure.
I'm not
really
sure about
like
this war.
Right.
I'm okay with war.
Right.
And here's why I say that, because the answer, Lance, here, our little history tidbit, America has been at war 93% of the time
of its existence.
222 years out of our 239 years, we have been engaged in military conflict.
Not surprising.
So it's not something that we're unaccustomed to, right? It would be fair to say we're pretty used to this. We were born out of war, right?
Exactly.
We are a very militaristic country. Sometimes we don't like to think of it that way, but then the question becomes, if for most of our history we've been at war, and yet Congress and the president were able to balance these powers, why has it changed now? Where do we go from here? Those are the questions coming up. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
The United States has been at war 93% of its history. That's 222 years out of 239. Now, you can go and look at that for yourself. It was first published by Washington's blog and global research firm in February of 2015. The U.S. has only been at peace for 21 years total since its founding. So we've been engaged in all these different military conflicts for most of our history. And to me, Lance, that begs the question, if for the bulk of our history, right, we've been in these conflicts, but we've also mostly maintained the power balance between president, Congress, and the judiciary, why now, we kind of answered that question in the last segment, why has it been abdicated? Fear, lack of responsibility, lack of desire for responsibility, so on and so forth. But where should we put it in the modern age? Because it is different, right? I mean, back, most of the wars that we fought, most of that 93%, we knew who the enemy was, right? It was clear, it was defined. We're fighting Russia, right? We're fighting the Japanese, right? I mean, these things were easier to understand.
The American Indian.
Yeah.
Just so people understand how do you get to this 93? We've been fighting somebody somewhere over something.
Yes. And that may seem really large. I guess we're going to have a lot of sources linked for this episode. Sorry, Bradley, we're going to give you another one here, but we'll link that article so that if you want to read into it.
And here's a quote from the article. This is from a Harvard law professor who was a former Justice Department official for George W. Bush.
From which article? Times,
From the Times article, Jack Goldsmith. But notice he's from a Republican administration. And he says, quote, "Our country has quite self-consciously," I think that's the key phrase there, "given one person, the president, an enormous, sprawling military and enormous discretion to use it in ways that can easily lead to a massive war. That is our system. One person decides." And it's not written that way in the Constitution, but we've made that decision in the last 20 years to do that. Now, I'll throw something out there. Do you think that's because of our instant gratification society that we now live in? We don't want to, we debate it, in the House. The House has the right to whether or not to declare war, and the Senate has to vote whether or not, whatever, and then it goes to the president to implement it and run it and everything else. We're like, man, we can't do that. I mean, we've got drone strikes, we've got terrorism, we can't wait 6 weeks and have a debate over this to happen. So we have to be able to make this decision now. Well, how can we make that decision now? Well, we'll cede these powers to one person, i.e. the president, so that we can make these quick decisions, because we don't have the time available to us. Like if you go back to the War of 1812, the biggest land battle in the War of 1812 was fought weeks after the treaty had been signed in Europe, because they had to wait for the ships to get back with the news from Belgium before they could stop the war. And so the biggest land battle that made a hero out of Andrew Jackson, who was a future president because of the Battle of New Orleans, would not have happened in today's society because of the ability of instant communication. So we don't have time to debate these things as to whether or not we should go to war. So let's give the president, I wonder about that. That's my thought.
My thinking is, I'm sure it has some to do with that because, right, Congress, our whole government, Congress, the president, not necessarily the judiciary, but to an extent, them too, because they're part of society.
Well, they have powers.
They all of it responds, right, to the desires and the ebb and flow of societal norms. And one of those things, I think, is faster reaction. But at the same time, I'd say that I think it has more to do with, too, the nature of our enemies has changed a lot as well in regards to it being less defined. When George W. Bush says we're gonna go to war on terror, what the hell's that? And again, he tried to define it, but then as we started to fight this war on terror, we realized, holy crap, how do you?
They're on the continent of Africa. They're in Southeast Asia. They're in the Middle East. They're basically on.
Some coordinate, some don't.
Right.
They have different leadership, different motivation, different fighting methods. Some are supported by governments. Some are not.
There are cells in Europe. There are cells. Everywhere.
Right. It's a huge enemy, and the enemy's not just about physical fighting anymore, which I think complicates it more as well, right? Because it used to be, for example, we go back to the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, right? A U.S. base, and they kill U.S. personnel. And that's really easy to understand, right? We were attacked by another nation who meant our people harm, and therefore we go attack them, and our soldiers fight each other, right? That's what we're doing. We got it. We can take time to debate that. We can take time to discuss that. It makes sense. Now we have, a terrorist organization that builds a bomb that fits in a briefcase, goes to the center of London and blows somebody up, and we don't know what the hell happened or where they came from, Right. So it's, I don't know. I think part of it has to do too with.
I think we're both pretty much in agreement as I listened to you.
Yeah.
Maybe you explained it a little bit differently than I did, but it's like, okay, we have to do something now, and we're fighting differently than we ever have before.
Right. I guess what I mean to say is I think the desire of the American people to rush to action is not good. At the same time, I think the requirement to rush to action is real, in that in some cases, if we don't find these people or react quickly, you lose the opportunity to at all, because they disappear forever and you can't find them again. So,
but see, I would counter that with, we eventually found Osama bin Laden. We eventually find these people that we know
Sure.
are in charge. So why do we rush to get our people in harm's way when we can use other ways to get it done? That would be my counter
Right.
to what you say is, okay, it may take time, but wouldn't it be better to take time than to put Americans, either soldiers or civilians, in harm's way, ruin the economy, and all these other things that could happen by doing it the way we're doing it? I would like to see us take a step back, because doing it quickly isn't necessarily the best answer.
No. Well, and sometimes,
And especially when you give it in the hands of one person.
Sometimes
And I'm not saying that's
time is
Republican
needed
or
to
Democrat.
diffuse, right? Too, because it's not just
to step back and say, whoa, now is this really what I need to do? Because you and I can get mad at each other.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, bam, come to blows.
Right.
Okay. Or if we both step away and come back 2 days later, we're like, you know what? That argument was really kind of silly.
Yeah.
Let's push it aside. And we're really not mad at each other.
Right.
I was mad at, Brett, and, and you were mad at April. And so we argued, and it's like, wait a minute, we're not even mad at each other. That
Right.
wasn't even the start of this whole thing.
Yeah.
So,
but if you have time
but
to,
if I got a button right there, boy, I could do this. I'm going to take you out.
That's right.
That's not good.
No.
It should be. That's my whole point of why this is bad, to give one person this kind of power. And I'm not saying it's because it's Trump. I don't care who. I'm saying to the office of the president should not be one person, because
wouldn't matter if it was Bernie Sanders,
it
right?
doesn't. It causes us to be more reactionary this way. And that's not a good thing when you're talking about the way we can destroy people and places and things these days.
So here's because we talked about, so what should it be? I think that, part of what our framers envisioned is that things would change as time went on, right? And that they couldn't foresee everything. So they wanted to set it up in such a way that we could adapt and we could grow.
That's true.
At the same time, they wanted a framework that we operate under and that's difficult to alter our foundations without serious thought, consideration, and time, right? So I think part of what needs to happen is a requirement. We need to rescind, right, our 2001, all these powers that we've bestowed on the president. I mean, that's step one. Congress needs to yank those back. They should have been yanked back a while ago, or maybe never should have been put in place to begin with. But I also think that Congress, when they are authorizing military action, so we get back to them doing that, they have to put always renewal limits on these things.
Right.
Because the part of what's gotten us to where we are is these permanent type deals, and maybe you cap it to no more than a year ever, so that they're prohibited through the Constitution by ever authorizing military force for longer than a year. Because let's face it,
this is where your judiciary comes in. Because I'm going to pull the history nerd on you.
I'm
going back to the War Powers Act of 1973, because so many Americans were upset that so many presidents got us involved and escalated the war, the fighting in Vietnam. I will not. I almost slipped there and said war. It wasn't. It never was a declared war. I know. I understand. But people, I'm just trying to keep this straight. And people said, well, okay, we can't do that, so we're going to give the president the right to put troops anywhere they want for 30 days, and then they have to go to Congress.
Right.
Okay. There are people who study this and say, well, that's unconstitutional. And we've never had a case on it. So now here you are saying, well, we'll put a year's limit on it. And what I'm saying is we haven't decided on whether or not that's even constitutional.
I'm talking about putting it in the Constitution.
Or a year. Right. But what I'm saying is constitutional lawyers argue you may not be able to do that. That's not necessarily even legal to put it in the Constitution. That it would start but I think we need to have that debate. I'm on your side. We need to have that debate.
I mean, we should at least try,
because we're not. We've never debated it. We're just like, well, this is what it says. Well, yeah, okay. So what if I do this? Well, now I've done it. Okay, well, we'll give you the power to do it, and we're not even debating whether or not what's going on is constitutional or not, and we should have that debate.
Yep. I also think there should be a requirement that if and when the U.S., faces a potential foreign threat like this, that there's a requirement that Congress holds session on it within a certain amount of time. Because this is the other thing that happens, right? Presidents often use as a valid excuse, Congress isn't in session, or they're busy with this or they're busy with that, and I had to respond quickly. And the excuse is that Congress is too slow to defend ourselves. I mean, legitimately,
right.
There are times where the president may need to order troops immediately, like if we were actually attacked by a foreign power and it's like, okay, we have no choice. We have to fight back because we're under attack. Then I think that that's one of those situations where, you want to make sure that Congress is required to meet quickly for an initial decision about, we either want more time to think about it or we're going to put forward some kind of temporary resolution, So it gets a little more complicated, but I don't think that using force should be one of those things that's overly simplified either, because you're talking about putting our people in harm's way.
Well, why shouldn't the president, and this is going to open up a whole other can of worms, which we'll have to talk about another time, but think about this. Why shouldn't the president go to Congress and say, this is what I want to do. Give me a thumbs up or a thumb down before I do it. Because this is what I want to do. Now you tell me, because that's the way it says in the Constitution.
For the articles that we've talked about today and a lot of other things like the books that we're looking at, thestateofus.org is the resource. We referenced a lot of stuff today, so be sure to check it out. Lance, we've challenged people to tune in, right, to bring others into the conversation.
Yes, we have.
Because if they listen and they're getting something from the episode, then it's important that they share it with others, because that is the only way that the conversation becomes more effective, right?
That's right.
More people having these honest, open, respectful conversations. So if you were going to invite others to tune in, you're a listener, what are some of the ways you could tell them?
Well, you can get us through Spotify, Stitcher, or Apple Podcast, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast.
And again, thestateofus.org, this is a syndicated radio program and a podcast. So if you want the most up-to-date way to listen, be sure to check out our website. For The State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.